Thank you very much. It's a privilege and an honor to be here, to be able to present my ideas and to see how we are thinking about logic in this part of the world, as well as how we try to see how the idea of logic can actually be used to make sense of our realities in Africa. So, rigidity and the challenge of context in classical bivalent logic from an African perspective. So as the topic suggests, I want to explore the aspects of rigidity as it contains or expresses itself in the traditional laws of thought, and our context also play crucial roles in how we come to make sense of realities in Africa. And in a nutshell, the seemingly, how would I use this word now? The seemingly general assumption that classical bivalent logic is the same for everywhere and every people. So I think that is one thing. So the first thing for me to do is to take a look at the influence and the general nature of classical logic on African episteme. You know, classical logic, by classical logic, I mean the logic that was developed by Aristotle and has been developed on and on by prominent Western scholars down to the 20th and 21st century. So this logic is seen as absolute and universal. It's like, this is the standard that every idea must conform to. And so it entered Africa through colonial education and the colonial curriculum. And if this is the case, we should also take cognizance of Susan Stebbins' position that whoever seeks to study the history of Western ontology ought to first be grounded in Aristotle's logic. If this is also true, then it means that if these ontological theories, non-Western, cannot be situated properly into Aristotle's logic, then there will be a problem. And of course, there was a problem. So the question is Aristotle's bivalent logic the so-called standard logic pliable for expressing African thoughts? I don't think that is true. And for the number of slides we'll be seeing, I will show why that is not the case. Now, when the early missionaries entered Africa, one of the things that they did was to say that the African has no capacity to think logically. So scholars such as the French anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl in his primitive mentality has taken the position that Africans are pre-logical. Now, when you take a look at Hawthorne, Robin Hawthorne, who has taught in several universities in Nigeria, according to some who know Hawthorne even speaks some African languages. He says that logic lies at the core of philosophy, and their demonstrable absence in traditional Africa reinforces the obvious absence of philosophy in African traditional system. Within the same page of that same work, it continues to say that Africans do not stop to ask, what are the irreducible basic processes of inference, or how they can be justified? Situations which would provide such questions simply do not arise. And this is because of the fact that the way the Western trained scholars expect the Africans to think logically falls short, because the African thinks in a particular way that makes the classical bivalent logic not to conform to that idea. So it's as a result of comments of this nature that the Africans have had to suffer the tedious task of demonstrating his or our humanity by trying to show that, no, I am logical, perhaps not logical by your own standard, but I am logical. Now, in spite of all of this fact that the African is logical in their own way, there are also some Western scholars who have called for the rigid character of classical laws of thought. For instance, the notable Alfred Whitehead says that we are told by logicians that a proposition must be either true or false and there is no middle term. But in practice, we may know that a proposition expresses an important truth, but it is subject to limitations and qualifications which at present remain undiscovered. The implication in Whitehead's excerpt that I have used here is that classical logic and the laws of thought, wherein a proposition can only be true or false and nothing in between, falls short because they are middle positions in some instances. Just because of the limitations in knowledge that we have, we may not be able to arrive at those truths. So Whitehead is basically saying that it is possible to have a third value rather than the normal C and F that we have. Whitehead is not the first to have made this assertion. Oh, I forgot to add Leibniz. Leibniz was said to have also added the fourth law, a fourth supplementary law to the three classical laws of thought. He calls that law his famous principle of sufficient reason, PSR. And the PSR has not been really taken seriously by the logic community in the Western world. Similarly, scholars such as Karl Marx and Hegel have questioned the inflexible nature of the classical laws of thought, as though any attempt to tamper with these laws of thought is an anathema that is like tampering with something sacred. And any of such a thing would crumble the system. But in the light of modern physics and emergence of quantum theory, scholars such as Hans Reichenbach and Andre Aldo Frege have come to the conclusion that classical logic cannot mediate thoughts for quantum logic. Although this is a matter of debate because we have scholars such as Tim Maudlin saying that no, they want to maintain that rigid character that no, this is a logic system that is true, that is applicable in all climes, irrespective of who you are. Your thoughts must be able to be represented by this system logic. So I now move into context and facts. Before now, I have them being rigid logic because of its emphasis on just an African version of logic that was published by Chimakuna and Jonathan in 2019. It's a three-valued logic, and it has three supplementary laws of thought to the three laws of thought in classical logic. But save for time, I will not be able to go deeply into that. But I think Chimakuna takes some of his inspirations from Gottlob Frege. And according to Frege, Frege says that we should not ask for the meaning of a word in isolation, but only in the context of a proposition. So what it means is that when a proposition is altered, it is within that proposition, the context of that proposition, where it is written that they extract this idea and inject it into its three-valued logic with the supplementary laws and develop a context-dependent value. See, on this context-dependent value is positioned that context upsets facts. So to show how context upsets facts in ways that classical logic cannot contain, I will demonstrate it with this is a syllogistic argument. The second premise is socially is now. So just as I pointed out here, this is an argument that will be rendered as invalid in some contexts. The fallacy of composition and the converse accident will be invoked, and then the mood and figure thing will come in to state whether or not arguments. But from the African perspective, it will be considered valid and sound, because when you invoke the idea that the Africans believe in ancestorship, that means that we do not really die. We transcend the present reality of existence, present planes of existence. And there have been efforts to see African parapsychologists talking about conversing with the dead wishing to come back to the world. And when you read stuff like Ian Stevenson's Cases of the Reincarnation Type, you realize that the fact that Sophie Oluwole is eternal commands a lot of respect, and all Africa were meant to be eternal is going to be taken as both true and sound for the African. So it is in this way that Chimakunam says it would be unreasonable to make such an inductive leap and generalize that property. There is no sufficient cause for such an effect. That is how the Western world will see these syllogistic arguments. Now, by invoking the logical thesis in Ezumezu logic, like I said, I would not be able to expatiate on this, but I have some works where I have also already discussed and detailed this logic deeply, I have been able to expatiate that there are some aspects, such as the fact that in African ontology, the constant interaction between the physical and the non-physical makes it possible for traditional Africans to not die, in quotes. So if that is the case, then the context with which this logistic argument happens or is uttered, take cognizance of the fact that for the Western speaker, this argument will be invalid and it will be accused of various fallacies. But in the case of the African, it will be considered as valid and sound, because they take cognizance of other context values that usually upset facts. Now I go to another example to show how context upsets facts. I'm going to use a Yoruba phrase here and talk a little bit about William Quine's indeterminacies of radical translation. Let me start with that. Quine, in his Word and Objects, claims that when there is a translation from, say, English language from Yoruba language into English language, and there is a problem in translation, that usually the aim is to blame the native language as being incompetent or not encompassing enough, whereas we should also look at the language of the interpreter. That is what indeterminacies of radical translation in Quine talks about. Now, in the Yoruba proposition that I have here, it says, what this means literally is, it is money that I have come to count. I have no desire to read. Now, the term ka, which appears twice, carry two senses following Frege signs and sense. Now, within this context, ka appears twice. In the first sense, ka means read. Within the same preposition, it also means to count. Now, these are going to be issues of fallacies of four terms, quaternium, coterminous, and stuff. But in other instances, ka also means to confess. Ajalaka nile fashino. Ajala confessed in the house of Fashino. So ka here signifies to confess. So some of the problems that African ontology has had up till now is the failure to see that some words do not match the context with which the Western ethnographer, anthropologists, sociologists have tried to use in examining how Africans make sense of ideas and how the truths of their propositions are grounded in the context where they are uttered. So now I move to the concluding remarks. The concluding remark here is that classical bivalent logic with its T and F, nothing in between, is faulty, and this truth must be made clear. Yes, I also need to state that there have been efforts in the not dominant tradition about valued logic, multi-valued logic, demand thoughts in this field. And it's also should be known that classical logic has contributed to the misrepresentation and distortion of African thought systems. I've already hinted about this a while ago, that some of the problems that were encountered by the first foreign people to enter Africa and access African intelligence was based on the use of Aristotle's logic to examine the natives' way of reasoning. And as a result of that, the inferences concerning African intelligence has been distorted and misrepresented. And it is not a matter of surprise to find scholars like Horton, scholars like Lucien Levy-Burrell saying that the Africans has no sense of logic, as the assumption is that the logic system that is coming from the West is universal and absolute. Like I told Estefania yesterday, there's no problem with the logic system being universal. Of course, rationality is a universal. So all logic systems have to be universal. But the problem is to say that a logic system is absolute means that it is the best and nothing else can override it. That is one of the problems I'm facing, and I'm talking about how to decolonize this conception. So it is now important to consider seriously other alternative logic system. For Africans, for instance, we have been working on several alternative logic systems that go beyond the classical two-value logic system. And so we are also looking at how to make a universal appeal for this logic to be used not only in Africa, but in climes non-African, and see how it can also make sense. So we can say, okay, Africans have been able to contribute immensely to the development of logic. So based on these, I have been able to talk about the context that makes propositions to get their truths, and the rigidity that needs to be decolonized in classical logic. And based on these, I think I will now stop here, and I will see how to get feedbacks from you and see if I can learn one or two things at this junction. So thank you very much, and thanks for your patience and your time. Thanks.